Anyway, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
How is everybody today?
Fine.
Good, good. We finished the previous series, Women in American History, and which was a fun series to do. There really was. Though I had a number of people tell me that they really wanted to wait for this one. I guess it depends on your interest in history to a certain extent, but let's understand one thing here. It is 100 years ago, the Russian Revolution. And is this a game changer in events for the 20th century? Yeah, it sure is. Although really what this is, it's emblematic of changes going on at the world at this time. You're in the third full year of what's known as the Great War. I call it the European Civil War because to me that's about what it is. And at this time in 1917, it's more than just Russia here, folks. The French army mutinies. 54 divisions will mutiny in 1917. Some of these guys have had enough of the trenches. And you're seeing various things happen here in 1917. You're even seeing some of these airmen who see the carnage of the trenches, people like, later Billy Mitchell, Sir Hugh Boom Trenchard of England, who's considered by the United States Air Force as a godfather of strategic bombing. Giulio Douay of Italy. And these are fellows who understand, at least to a certain extent, war in the modern era. It's industrialized, it's commercialized, and it's vast. It's almost limitless by comparison to other wars. War now has gone from the Napoleonic era where maybe you were confined to a certain area of a battlefield to now what? Does this change how you're going to prosecute war? Yes. But at the same time, with industrialization, you're seeing it's almost limitless. It's vast. And you're able to command a wide area, which means what? As these factories have increased in number, what's technology doing? Evolving. And so you can no longer rely on volunteers and professional soldiers. You now need to conscript entire populations and economies for war. And a man before this war is going to warn about this. His name is Vladimir Lenin, who was the socialist who stayed true to his cause, telling workers, don't obey your leaders, don't obey your generals, don't go fight. And he said that modern war on this level will command populations and economies, and these wars will last for years. Wow. And he said the death tolls will go up, and he says who's going to fight these wars? The worker. That's a rallying cry for Lenin. But in 1917, yes, French soldiers revolt in the trenches. So there's a lot going on here. A whole lot going on here. But at the same time here, I thought with today, before you get into this, and we're going to get into this, it might be a good idea to have a better understanding of this thing known as communism. I mean, that's basically what we're talking about on the end here to a certain extent. Although let's understand one thing as we get on with this, and I'm not going to dwell on him now, but I'm going to get to him at the end. Mr. Stalin. In fact, I will be back here in January with another 4-talk series on Stalin's Revolution. Boy, that's a barn burner, that one is. And Mr. Stalin really can't be construed as a communist. I think that's a stretch. Mr. Stalin is for Stalin. Uncle Joe was a ardent, we'll call it, Stalinist. And when we get to that one, I'm going to get into how he actually was using state capitalism inside the Soviet Union to build the factory system. But that's down the road. But communism, well, what the heck is it? Starting with socialism. Note that handout. Oh, by the way, on the third page of that handout, I want to let you, I've already made the correction on my master at home. In the middle of the page, you see the year 1930, and below that, 1934, should be 1830, 1834. So if you want to make your changes here. It's like going to the ball game with your program here. Third baseman's out and they got Joe Maserati's taking his place here. So, but having said that, you know, this idea of communism, or if you want to go first with Marxism, go ahead. Go ahead, because Karl Marx will make this a poster child expression of so-called communism. But then we're going to get into, too, a little bit down the road here, how Marx's idea of communism was a, you can use the term classless society. That's the term I used. However, it could be, you could go back to having a single class in your society. But a classless society, it means what? Well, the nobility will be gone, the bourgeoisie will be gone, middle class will be gone. There's only the workers. There's only the workers. That's basically what he's talking about here. Why? Because by 1848, again, the Industrial Revolution is snowballing, capitalism is snowballing, the nobility is going the way of the dodo, society and the economies are changing, and again, war. In fact, you see a real example. In fact, I just was talking about this last Friday. The Civil War. The American Civil War is an example of where war is going. Even those planters. I call the Civil War the revolt of the planters. It's basically what it is. The South? Yes, but who's going to win? They're going to fight a conventional war. Who's going to win it in the end? The North. Where's most of the people? Up north. Who has most of the factories and the resources? The North. Who has most of the money? The North. And Grant understands this. Grant will wage, and again, Lenin will feed off of this. Grant / Sherman waged that war of attrition in the South. Let's destroy the Southern economy instead of going and waging these big battles and having a lot of people get killed. And so, interesting, a Russell Weagley will make the jump here later on down the road. Mr. Weagley says, if you look at what Grant and Sherman did with their war of attrition. Grant tied down Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, while Mr. Sherman went right across the South, from one end of the Confederacy to the other, on a 60-mile-wide path of destruction, tearing up the railroad tracks, burning up the rolling stock, burning up the cotton bales, ripping up the farms and taking what they can't, and destroying what they can't take. That was economic warfare. Then Mr. Weagley's going to say, again going back to people like Sir Hugh Boone Trenchard, Julio Douay, and our own Billy Mitchell. And he says that in 1942 to 45, if you look at the British Bomber Command of the RAF and the United States 8th Army Air Force, they did the same thing with B-17s, B-24s, Lancasters, and Halifaxes. Instead of riding on horses, you're now doing it from 25,000 feet. Modern war. This is what Lenin's going to rail about. But then again, at the same time here, you're seeing again these changes effervescing. This idea of socialism. You know, these ideas of the age of reason, age of enlightenment, unleashed for the most part by our revolution, and then what some people consider the granddaddy of revolutions, the French. The difference here is, and some of you people have heard me say this before, one of the reasons we will succeed is because we're 3,000 miles from Europe. The French are in the belly of the beast. And even though this revolution starts in 1789, by 1792 some of these monarchs taking a look and said, boy, we better strangle this in the womb. The Great French War. The French Revolutionary Wars first, 1792, 1802, and then the Napoleonic Wars, 1803, 1815. And so the French Revolution will not succeed to the extent ours does. It degenerates into a dictatorship with Napoleon. But it's too late to close the barn door. Those ideas are already out and resonating here. Liberalism, democracy, republicanism, secularism, socialism, nationalism, parliamentarianism. Holy Christmas, the sky's the limit. It's kind of late to close the barn door, and the Congress of Vienna won't close it. And so when you take a look at this thing known as socialism, there are some people that resonate. And like anything else man does with socialism. Well, what is socialism? Centralized control of the means of production or collective ownership of the means of production, which some people seem to think eliminates the fraud and waste and inequalities of capitalism. You know, you're getting that argument now. You're getting that argument now. And then it divides into a couple of schools here. The utopian socialist, the scientific socialist. Well, what the heck is a utopian socialist? These people believe that you can accommodate the system and then implement socialism. We're not going to tear apart the producers versus the consumers. We want to bring them all together. Marx doesn't believe this. Marx does not believe this at all. He comes out of that Georg Hegel school, the philosopher, the German philosopher, who was really, you know, and that's interesting too about Hegel. Here's a fella who put forth the idea of ardent nationalism. Translate that into German. Keep in mind, Germany is new here. You know, it's developing. Of course, when he comes along, there's that issue of German dualism, where after the Congress of Vienna, you know, Napoleon actually begins the trend here with his Confederation of the Rhine, putting together 16 German states as a buffer to Russia, Czarist Russia. Interesting what happens down the road. Clemenceau is a big booster of a Poland, of a Hungary, of a Czechoslovakia, of an Austria, and so on and so forth, to do what? As a buffer to Bolshevik Russia. What difference is there here? Not an overburdening amount. Keep out Russia, no matter what kind of country it is. And again, that lends to what George Kennan said. It doesn't make any difference what kind of Russia we're talking about. Whether Tsarist Russia, Stalinist Russia, Khrushchev's Soviet Union, Brezhnev's Soviet Union, or Putin's Russia. He'll live long enough to see it. Russia is Russia. Which I like to say the same thing about the Iranians. Persia's Persia. And I know that people would take odds with that, but anyway, the fact of the matter is here, even socialism has a split. And so Marx, though, believes in this thing known as dialectical materialism. Now, what the heck is that? You know, again, Georg Hegel came out with that. The idea here is, what do you mean get together, have producers get together with consumers? You know, and people like Saint-Simon, what was called a socialist, believes that people have various wants, needs, and desires. Marx's idea is, oh, no, we can't accommodate the violent overthrow. His reasoning is based on, his rationale is based on reasoning and logic. He's probably realistic here, considering the playing field here in the 19th century. It's interesting the differences coming up here. Now, when you look at somebody like Claude, Henri, de Rivroy, Comte de Saint-Simon, say that 3 times real quick. You know, he's born in 1760. He'll die in 1825. He was actually an aristocrat, but he had a feeling for people's problems. He is a very learned character. Will actually at one point have an audience with the Emperor of Mexico, talking about having a canal built in Central America, long before it's done, but hey. He also comes to the United States. He will fight for the United States, or fight for the colonists against the British. And he's a big booster of our Declaration of Independence. That's interesting, because that's one of my favorite documents. That should be changed. It should be called our Article of Faith. That's basically what it is. You imagine that document says you have the right to throw off your government if you want to. Basically what it says here. If it's too draconian, if it's too oppressive, it is not only the people's right, the people's duty to throw it off and put together new guardians for their security. Boy, is that inflammatory? Yeah. Well, people like Saint-Simon find solace in this. And he'll be turned off, though, by the carnage of the French Revolution. And I'm sure as a Frenchman, he's probably disappointed it didn't work out like ours did by 1781, 1782. But keep in mind, again, They're in the belly of the beast. They're surrounded by the monarchs. We were not, which is why by 1792 the Great French War is on. Those monarchs are trying to kill these ideas. And they're not going to do it. You know what's fascinating about that? When the Dutch and the Austrians invade, they almost get to Paris. The Battle of Valmy is actually one of those most important battles in European history. Because if they could have gotten to Paris, perhaps they could have killed the revolution. Interesting here how history repeats. Because if you go back from 1792, 1793 and see this, and then fast forward to 1919, 1920, when the Poles invade Russia and get almost to Kiev before the Reds throw them back. Well, what did the French revolutionaries do? They threw back the Dutch and the Austrians. And now it's going to be a long war. Fascinating how these things coincide here. Fascinating. But he believes, Saint-Simon believes, that there has to be some kind of feeling for the worker. Believes in a national school, perhaps, that will have different branches in the nation, schooling people as workers to take their place in society. And he's one of those who believes that perhaps the government can be an empire in the economy. That's interesting. Again, one of the plethora of ideas that are beginning to circulate here. Although some political scientists really don't think Saint-Simon was a real socialist, it looked as though he was criticizing, not building. And then there's Robert Owen from England, who was born in Wales in 1771, and he'll die 1858. He actually, as a young, he was considered a very, very intelligent person as a young man. Not an avid supporter of religion, by the way. Of course, that's becoming prevalent here as the church is falling into disrepute here. And so he, by the way, will be taken in by a man who owns a cotton mill. He will eventually be running a cotton mill. And he develops various ideas here. He's considered actually the father of British socialism, the father also of British cooperation. In other words, worker co-ops, which is going to come on down the road here. And he tries an experiment at New Lanark in Scotland, where he puts together this development where people can virtually, for the most part, work together. And what he does is he tries to make working conditions a lot better for them. Keep in mind what he does here. He cuts the working day from 17 hours to 10. Wow. He has the roads rebuilt to and from going to work. He tries to cut down on infectious diseases, cleanliness, so on and so forth. Interesting character here. Interesting character here. And he also tries to cut down on the prices at the general store for the workers so they can buy goods and still have money left over and not have their wallets raped. Again, Mr. Stalin will come along when he starts his program of forced industrialization and underpay the people and overcharge them for the shoddy goods they're going to buy and then plow the proceeds back into the system to build more factories. Interesting how Mr. Owen is not like Mr. Stalin here. However, keep in mind, Mr. Owen is going to try to bring this idea to the United States. In 1824, New Harmony, Indiana, he actually has a few bucks. He's going to buy up 30,000 acres to create this. It doesn't go over that well. And my opinion of that is, I think because there's England, is there manifest destiny going on in England here this time? No, there isn't. And so what is the race among people here? Land. They're constantly on the move and going for land. Again, what did John Adams say? For a functioning system of representative government, the wide ownership of land, and boy, people are grabbing that and going with it. Why would you want to get into a socialist experiment in New Harmony, Indiana? a lot more going on to the west of New Harmony, Indiana. I have a chance of making a whole brand new life for myself. Especially if you're the solitary type. Why would I want to get with a bunch of people for New Harmony, Indiana when I can go grab 10, 20, 50, 100 acres of my own? And so Mr. Owen will use up 80% of his wealth for a failure. He will go back to England, but again, he gets involved in British cooperation or worker co-ops. That's becoming popular. It's really becoming popular, where maybe workers own factories instead of the standard CEO or the standard owner with a board of directors, which is coming on, so on and so forth. No, the workers own it. The workers own it, and they divide the profits. Or maybe they pick one of their own to oversee the project, and he doesn't make much. He or he doesn't make much more than the average worker does. And so this idea is beginning to resonate. But then again, there's another man named Louis Blanc. Now here you see a socialist, for want of a better description, a utopian socialist. He's born in 1811 and will die in 1882. He's French. He will write a, you might consider it a landmark history of the French Revolution. Louis Blanc. His grandfather will be executed as a counter-revolutionary during the French Revolution. His father, though, will wind up as a government functionary in the financial department of the French Army of Occupation in Spain when Napoleon invades Spain in 1808. However, when Napoleon is defeated, keep in mind his family, Louis Blanc's family, will be voted to have a pension by the French government. So they're not left destitute. But Mr. Blanc is another one of those who perhaps has a feeling for his fellow man. He believes in having a national effort of workers. That the worker needs to be trained even in school to prepare for his part in the French economy. He believes, he actually believes here that there should be a national school, a national house for workers, but at the same time, that should be chapters or precincts throughout France. What he's prophesizing here to a certain extent is syndicalism. That's interesting, where workers actually run the country. Interesting how that is. You might have garbage men running the country. In fact, with syndicalism, there will be a national syndicate of workers actually running the country. And you're going to have your precincts in the outback or spread throughout the country. And if you think about it to a certain extent, this was the Soviet Union in 1917, 1918. Keep in mind when we get there, you will see these things called Soviets, which are actually committees. That's how they start. And I like to compare them to what happened here, the beginning of our revolution, just prior to the 1775, in 1773, 74, when colonists were rising up in their locales throughout the 13 colonies, some places more than others. Massachusetts would be a big one, where the people would push out Crown-appointed administrators and enact committees of safety or committees of public safety. Yeah, we're done with you, get out. And then they would take over themselves. Interesting how that is. Well, it's not much different than in 1917 St. Petersburg, or Petrograd, let's call it what they called it, Petrograd, where you had workers, soldiers, and peasants putting together Soviets to run a district in St. Petersburg or a district just outside St. Petersburg. And you're going to hear that again. In fact, that should be pounded into your heads, because this is understanding that there are ties between what happened in Russia in 1917 and what was going on here in 1774. Not much different to a certain respect. In fact, that terminology, committees of public safety, that's going to resonate in France in 1789. And what's going to be really interesting when we go down the road is what Lenin learned from the French Revolution. But Mr. Blanc is one who believes that the worker should get a better deal. Keep in mind, in 1848, the springtime of nations, you know, the French workers are feeling their oats here. And Louis Philippe of the House of Orleans, who was a constitutional monarchy of sorts, will be pushed out of power and he'll retreat to England. But because of police intrigues, because of the fact of a failing economy, the famine. What were many Irish doing here? Coming here. Potato famine? But it was all over Europe. Ireland, France, some of the German states, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. People are rising up. It'll be put down, but it's called the springtime of nations for one reason. It's a mass uprising. You know, this idea of getting rid of the monarchs is resonating here. And we're immune from that because this country did its due diligence by 1781, throwing the crown out of here. I always got a kick out of John Hancock when he signed the Declaration of Independence. His signature was because he understood that George III couldn't see too well. Is that nerve or what? Boy, that's nerve. But then again, it kind of resonates with what, you know, taking a chance like that, you can say what you want, but Ben Franklin might have been right. We either hang together or we hang separately here. Yeah. Yeah. And so Blanc believes that, yes, we should have a national government that takes in the workers. And there will be a new government. And it's interesting. You have a National Assembly of 876 representatives. Only 100 will be socialists. They do put together, you know, these national houses, if you want to call it that, of training workers or getting workers ready for the economy. But what do they turn out to be? Relief centers. You know, the government is decidedly middle class. They don't want to really help the worker. They want to maintain control. And after that, Blanc is going to go to England for 20 years, but he will return. He will be elected to the French Assembly. But at the same time, he takes a knock here from the workers or the more liberal end of the French society when he doesn't support the Commune. He doesn't support the Commune in 1871. But Mr. Blanc, his place in history is assured as that one person who, well, there were a number, but as one of those people who is that tie between the modern worker getting a better shake in his society with Marx. Only he does not believe in the violent overthrow. He believes in the assimilation of the worker in society and having a place in running that society. Not so Mr. Marx, who was born in Germany in 1818. He comes to the conclusion, based off Georg Hegel, that there's only one way the worker is going to improve his lot, and that's the violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie or the ruling class. He is a big proponent of the abolition of private property. Big proponent of that. And that's interesting because over here, our system of government or our system of rule, or our system of allowing the common everyday Joe of getting ahead was the ownership of private property. And again, Adam says this, if you want a functioning system of representative government, you need a wide ownership of property. I don't think I have to tell you today that's under threat because the largest landlord in this country is Blackstone Group, a hedge fund. That's comforting. You can imagine what John Adams would say about that if he was around today. Or even Alexander Hamilton, the man who said every society develops into two types, well, the rich and the well-born and then the mass, and leave to the rich and well-born a permanent foot in ruling the country. I always thought Adams' idea of the wide ownership of land kind of conflicted with that. So they weren't all firing on all cylinders together here, you know, in the early rounds of our country here. But Marx, by the way, is interesting, and I always found this fascinating here. His idea, the abolition of private property. He says here, the abolition of existing property relations is not at all a distinctive feature of communism. All property relations in the past have continually been subject to historical change, consequent upon the change in historical conditions. The French Revolution, for example, abolished feudal property in favor of bourgeois property. The distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of private property generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property. But modern bourgeois private property is the final and most complete expression of the system of producing and appropriating products that is based on class antagonism and the exploitation of the many by the few. Interesting, he says, because the bourgeoisie owns most of the property because most of the factories are built on whose property? The bourgeoisie. So what is the factory worker reduced to? The factory worker is the propertyless class, the proletariat. He's working for the bourgeoisie. He's turned into a wage slave. Obviously here, you would hazard a guess and say that maybe Mr. Marx agrees with Mr. Adams here. There's not true freedom because does the worker own his property? No. Who owns most of the property? The privileged class. Which is why perhaps Mr. Owen's idea of the new lanarch didn't fly in 1824 America. There was always land to grab over the horizon. Why do I want to get stuck in something like this for? So Americans are infected with this fever of owning private property, even if it's just 5 or 10 acres, or you own a ranch the size of Rhode Island, which happened. Then there were some ranches that were absolutely huge. Could have qualified for states, especially in places like Texas, which takes you a while to cross anyway. No. So it's interesting what you're developing here as opposed to in Europe. I mean, when this book comes out, the Communist Manifesto in 1848, interesting here, I find this fascinating that when our founders put forth republican government, not democracy, republican government, that's what they said that they were building. And that's radical. Why is it radical? Because it ran against the established trend, which was what? Royalty. The people be able to determine their own fate? Who came up with that stuff? And so you are seeing here a counter to the trend, the generally accepted trend, because what? Many of these monarchs, if they're not fighting with each other, make deals with each other, right? At the expense of the mass. That's how that works. And later on, when you get into this, especially in the 19th century, aren't many of these royal houses related in one way or another? All the interbreeding going on? And again, some of you heard me mention this, but it needs to be repeated again. Some of these people with this interbreeding couldn't, I mean, some of the elevators aren't going to the top floor. I mean, like my father used to say, the lights are on, but there's nobody home. And yet they're deciding the fate of millions by playing Monopoly and with real buildings on a real map board. And so when you see our idea of a republic, based on the wide ownership of property, that's radical. And then look at Saint Simon, who found solace in our Declaration of Independence. And he wasn't the only one. He wasn't the only one. Our Declaration of Independence helps these revolutions, or spurs revolution, 1820, 21, 1830, 31, 1848, Springtime of Nations. And yet in 1848, Marx comes out with this dogma, together with Friedrich Engels. No, the abolition of private property. And yet by the early 20th century, who's going to grasp this? Lenin. Marxist Leninism. And so this will be just as radical in 1914, 1917 as American republicanism was in 1787, 1790, 1800. Why? Because it runs against the established trend. But again, what is it? The worker determine his own fate? You got to be kidding. So yes, they do have something in common. I'm talking people like Franklin, people like Monroe, Madison, people like this, and Jefferson. They have something in common with a Marx and an Engels and a Lenin and a Trotsky and a Grigory Zinoviev. They run against the established trend. Interesting that since the American and French revolutions, these various ideas that people are grasping for and then shoving society in the various different directions. That shows what? Central authority is collapsing, the monarchs. And Marx also states, interesting here because, communism is considered what? An international movement? But Marx says, and that's interesting here too. Where is it? I have it here. Though not in substance, yet in form, the struggle of the proletariat with the bourgeoisie is first a national struggle. The proletariat of each country must, of course, first of all, settle matters with its own bourgeoisie before it can become an international movement. Interesting observation here. He's quite right, If you're in Germany and you think you're going to solve Germany's problems by going into France, how's that going to work? You need to organize the bourgeoisie, the proletariat in your own country before you move on. Of course, Trotsky in 1917, 1918, 1919 was for pushing the Russian Revolution into Poland, into Germany, into France, and boy, that's not what Clemenceau and Lloyd George wanted. Which is why, yes, we're going to arrange a Poland and Austria, a Hungary, a Czechoslovakia as a bulwark to this. But Marx's idea of this proletariat is going to gain credence with people who are down on their luck, who are working and slaving in some of these factories and not getting ahead. Which is why you are seeing here trade unionism. Yeah, workers getting together, perhaps various unions getting together, forming umbrella groups. There's a lot of backing and filling going on here as you go through the 19th century toward the 20th. But of course, one of the decisive factors that's going to kill the monarchs is nationalism. And so when you bounce off things like Marx and the Communist Manifesto and you get to the 20th century, it's interesting, by 1914, many of these flaming socialists became ardent nationalists when their country went to war. You know who was one of those? Sigmund Freud. I'm giving all my libido to Austria. Who, by the way, some of you heard me mention this before, was the uncle to Edward Bernays, who's going to help fashion American opinion here that this war was fought for democracy. He will be the father of American public relations / propaganda. He's an interesting character to get to know. Edward Bernays, probably one of the most influential Americans you might never have heard of. But that comes out of this too. He believed that, based off his experiences in World War I, that the modern democratic... Again, here is centralized control. This is what Marx is talking about too. Centralized control, a dictatorship of the proletariat. But Bernays believes, it's fascinating, Bernays believes that people, when they go vote, they think who they're voting for runs the country. He says, wrong. He says it's people you never heard of that really run your country because they fashion the opinions. That's what Bernays said. That's what he said. He says, modern democratic societies cannot exist without this. And so when people say I'm free to vent my opinion, yes, but you're channeled a certain way here. And Mr. Bernays was excellent at doing this. Well, isn't that what Marx is doing now? Channeling people in a certain direction. The violent overthrow of the established order. That's doctrinaire Marxism. Fascinating what you're seeing develop here as you come to the 20th century. Again, coming out of these ideas unleashed from the Age of Reason and Age of Enlightenment through the American and French revolutions. But of course, it's a lot more perhaps confusing in Europe. Here, the Europeans really don't influence us at this point. We're spreading on our own. And so our idea of a Republican form of government is going to spread here, as long as there's the wide ownership of private property. But by the time you get to the 20th century, and you begin to see in Russia at this point, the idea of undermining the monarch. I'm going to get into that more next week. But Mr. Lenin, of many of these socialists, stays with his cause. You know, he writes these pamphlets, What is to be Done? Another one is Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, where he believes, as Marx states in the Communist Manifesto, the capitalist or the bourgeoisie is always looking for a new market. He might despoil the previous market to make a new market as he keeps searching. And he's still reducing the lot of the worker. Why? Because he's looking to make a profit. Lenin is stating at this point, coinciding with Marx perhaps, and he's urging people when this war starts in 1914, do not listen to your leaders. Do not listen to your commanders if you're in the army. Do not fight in this capitalist-inspired war. All they're interested in doing is increasing their pockets, getting new colonies, and taking control of the markets in other lands. As a worker, revolt against this. He's not going to be well thought of in certain circles. But he doesn't give up on this message. He keeps fighting for this message. And is he going to be popular afterwards? Yes. And so it will no longer be Marxism. What are people going to call it? Marxism, Leninism. Basing his revolution off the proletariat, the worker. However, you get into the 1920s, someone else is going to come along here, and he will be enduring a crackdown in the late 1920s, and his name is Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong is a communist, although he's a revolutionary nationalist too, like Ho Chi Minh would be. You know, Ho Chi Minh was one of the founders of the French Communist Party. Yeah, that seems odd, but he was. But Mao, by this point, I'm getting ahead a little bit, but I'm trying to make the difference between a proletarian-inspired revolution and a peasant-inspired revolution. The Russians had sent a Michael Borodin to assist the Chinese Communist Party. The factory worker is what entails the revolution. Mao's thinking, how many factories we got in China? It's not like it is now. How many factories we got in China? Peasants we got. So we base it off the peasant. And this will lead to another school of communist thought, and eventually is going to lead to a split between Red China and the Soviet Union. That's down the road. And Mao is going to say, the Chinese peasant is a blank sheet of paper, and I will write what I want to write. That's a pretty tall statement. But in the end, was he right? Yes. Yes. But this idea of utopian socialism where people have different wants and needs and desires, and we can assimilate socialism into the economy, is a direct opposition to what Marx is going to come out with, the violent overthrow of the established order. Because again, basing it on Georg Hegel, and Hegel is interesting here because Hegel, it's interesting, he appeals to both doctrinaire Marxists and later fascists. And that's not going to be a combo here. But Hegel appeals to both. Why? Number one, he thinks, Georg Hegel, and he states this, that war is man's uppermost endeavor. Is he right? Name another of man's pastimes that commands his time, treasure, and talents than war. Find one. That's what he says. He also says that the nation state is the highest example of human organization, and that the individual is second to the state. Of course, he also says the German national. He's a practitioner of German nationalism. Who's going to grasp that? The Nazis. Also, fascist Italy. But it also, and again, interesting, it appeals to Marxists. If war is the ultimate of human endeavors, then doesn't that coincide with the violent overthrow of the established order? Yeah, it does. It does. And we're also creating a centralized state, the dictatorship of the proletariat. But and again, does that reduce the individual? His importance? Yeah, it does. So does fascism. Because what does Mussolini say? The highest form of organization in a fascist state is the corporation. ExxonMobil would like that. And at the same time, in Mussolini, and he writes this in 1927, the Workers' Charter of 1927, that the individual is second to the state. The individual exists for the state. And Hegel is saying the same sort of thing. The individual is subsumed in the primacy of the state. But war is man's ultimate pastime. Again, the violent overthrow of the established order. And so if you come down to it, maybe Marx in the 19th century had the most realistic outlook. If the worker wants to win, he has to get his hands dirty. Forget trying to accommodate people who really don't agree with you. Take them out. I mean, when you look at revolution, isn't that what Americans did? Isn't that, look what happened to the French Revolution. Isn't this what the Russians are going to do? Isn't this what the Chinese are going to do? Isn't this what the Vietnamese are going to do? Isn't this what Castro did? Yeah, the violent overthrow. Speaks volumes of the human condition. Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Now that I've ruined your evenings. Anybody have any questions or comments? Yes, ma'am.
So if the workers are going to rule, how are they going to rule? It's going to be a republic? They're going to have representatives? How can the worker rule?
There will be a dictatorship of the proletariat. You're going to have worker control of all aspects of society, and they're going to break this down into precincts. Again, it's almost like we're looking at what? This thing called syndicalism, where, that doesn't really get much press in this country, where workers actually run the society. It's organized. You'll have a national syndicate, and then various syndicates around the nation where workers will actually, police, fire, yeah. And so this is virtually the same sort of thing, but it'll be where everyone will be, I called it a classless society, but everyone's a worker. How's that going to work? I mean, what is everybody, like a worker ant? And so, personally, I can't see how that's going to work. Because, maybe Saint-Simon and people like Louis Blanc understood it best that, Saint-Simon was one who didn't believe you'll never have equality. There will be people who stand out who have talents to make more. Okay, that's fine. But you'll never have strict equality. Man will never have strictly anything. How's that going to work? That runs counter to maybe your ambition to do something that maybe no one else wants to do. Individual initiative? With people who express their individual initiative, should they be rewarded for same? Sure they should. Why not? Why not? And so it kind of runs counter to human nature. Well, what are you going to do? Change human nature? How's that going to work? I mean, the Nazis tried that. The Soviets tried that. And if it didn't work, you wound up making ice cakes in Siberia. Or like General Konstantin Rokossovsky, who, during the crackdown of '37 in Stalin's Russia, I mean, they pulled out his fingernails and toenails and then sent him to Siberia. But then he'll be rehabilitated, though. So yeah, I don't agree how that's going to work. It's nice to say we're going to have a revolution and give the worker greater rights. That's one thing. But to wipe out the other classes and have just one class, Osama bin Laden thought at one point that they were going to have a caliphate, this idea of pan-Islam, and that all Muslims from Indonesia to Morocco would be part of this so-called Islamic State. Well, you saw in action here recently an Islamic State. I mean, I know a few Muslims who would like to live in an Islamic State with a caliphate or a caliph, but not what you're seeing now. A caliphate that would have relations with the outside world, but we would like. The few of them I know would like to live that way. That's fine. That's what you want to do. Fine. Of course, not what you're seeing now. And so, what do people in Indonesia have in common with people in Morocco, besides being Muslim? It's nice to have that kind of a tie, I suppose. I mean, to expect people in the United States to be in the same sort of political amalgamation with people in Russia. Aren't most of those people in Russia Christians? How's that going to work? It's not going to work. So I don't think Marx's idea would have worked. I don't think Osama bin Laden's idea would have worked. And so, should people be able to determine their own fate? Yes, but should there be some sort of national entity that has rule of law? Sure, there should. We're one of the best examples of that. Again, if you compare us to Russia, the Soviet Union, for the most part up through our history, you've seen this peaceful transfer of power. That's what you saw here. And credit George Washington for that. He starts it. He starts it. I mean, after his second term, after his first term, he wanted to go home. No, we need you. Stick around for another one. And then after his second term, no, I'm done. I'm out of here. But there was no gunfire. There was none of that. Those shenanigans. People voted for the next leader. Okay, what's wrong with that? Then fast forward to what you're going to see in the Soviet Union. After Lenin dies, there's no heir apparent. Why? Because there's no democratically orchestrated governmental scheme. Lenin killed that in January 1918, and I'll get into that. And so what does this leave the field for? A man like Stalin? And that probably helps prompt Churchill's comment after Lenin died. He says, the worst tragedy befall Russia was Lenin's birth. The next worst was his death. Churchill's funny in a certain respect because as an ardent foe of Bolshevism, and make no mistake, Churchill was an ardent foe of Bolshevism, and yet on June 23rd, 1941, the day after Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, what does he do? He goes to the House of Parliament and lends weight that Britain must support Russia in its time of need. You were the one that said, you were one of the greatest foes of Bolshevism, Lenin, Stalin, so on and so forth. And what is it, Mr. Churchill? Again, it's the art of the comeback. He would have been great on Dean Martin roasts. And he says, if Hitler invaded hell, I would make a favorable reference to the devil in Parliament. Yeah, interesting here. Interesting. And so, but when you know, this idea of Marx's idea of working, it runs counter to individual, and isn't free will one of the things that separates us from the animal kingdom? It's easy to get, ants are channeled. It's easy for worker ants to keep doing what they're doing. They're channeled that way. Although, I know some people are like worker ants. I'm sure you do too. So it runs counter to this idea of free will, human nature. How about critical thinking and free thinking? Yeah. So it's interesting what you're seeing here. Anybody else have any questions or comments? Yes?
I keep thinking about how fortunate we are with our republic, that we had all that land west of the Alleghenies for people to move to. You keep talking about land ownership. We're very fortunate that we had land to go to.
That's it. And what's interesting here, you make, you're bringing up a really pertinent point, because at the same time, this thing Manifest Destiny.
Yeah.
If you really get down to it, our form of imperialism was because folks like you could go get land. We're taking it from the Indian. I'll give you that. But the fact of the matter is, well, I can't make it too well in a hamlet, village, or a town, so I'm taking my family, and we're going 50 miles west and grab 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 acres, whatever the case may be. And when a lot of other people do the same thing, what does it become? A hamlet, a village, a town, a territory. What follows territory? Statehood. And so that's how we spread. But then again, if you compare it to Russia in the 18th, 19th centuries, they were in going back to the 16th and 15th centuries. They're undergoing Manifest Destiny because their empire is contiguous, just like ours was at the time of the 19th century. Only they're doing it different. It's the army taking the territory. Right. And who will take control of the landed gentry? What happened to the individual?
Crushed.
That crushed is right. It's a good term for it. Here, though, you are seeing the common everyday Joe. And what's interesting is the army's going to protect them. I'll give you that. But then what happens? It's business and the bankers who follow the people. Boy, there's something nobody really talks about, do they? The railroads will follow. The telegraph will follow and string all this together. So yeah. It's the common everyday Joe American that's doing this. Now that leads to the question, and I've been in various discussions about this, and some people, it's interesting the reaction of some people, supposing what you say didn't happen, then what would have happened to our republic? Would we have degenerated into a banana republic or some sort of, what is the South? I call it the revolt of the planters. Who owned a lot of the land? A restricted clique. The plantation owners, right? The southern aristocracy. Sure, you had your small farmer. But it's fascinating here. But you had, yes, that great move west. And some of them were foreigners. We mentioned before, the Irish? Some of the Germans coming here, the 1840s, 1850s. They can't do that in Europe. They can do it here. Interesting what you see here. Again, comparing America to Russia. Both had a form of Manifest Destiny. Yet, the Russian version is different than our version. They're creating an empire for what? The Romanovs after a while? And we're creating an empire. I always liken to Noah Webster. And maybe I'll bring it next week. And I have these 2 volumes of the debates on the Constitution. Boy, you want to read something, read that. It's a lot. But at the Constitutional Convention, do you know what Noah Webster says they were putting together? I love the terminology here. An empire of reason. It's a fascinating terminology. An empire of reason. Not that that exists now. That's open to discussion. Noah Webster, Daniel Webster's father. An empire of reason. Quite a term. Quite a terminology here. I think that kind of explains to a certain extent at least earlier. Empire of reason. People getting land like you were intimating before. Empire of reason. I'm doing this for my family, and then maybe to pad my pocket down the road, I'll give you that. But it's the individual initiative here. People deciding, well, I'm not going to live here, I'm going to go get some land. All right, that's fine. But that's how we spread. You know, Noah Webster. Noah Webster. Empire of reason. What a terminology for America. Wow. Interesting. Interesting. Next week I'm going to go into the lead into the Russian Revolution, Russia in the 19th century, into the 20th, and up to the start of the revolution. It's interesting what you see here. I always find it fascinating, and I bring this up in my various courses. Well, you've heard me say this, Gil, before, that the American Civil War, when it starts, one of our biggest boosters is Czarist Russia. That's interesting. Alexander II abolishes serfdom, and yet they're one of our biggest boosters. Abe, don't lose this war. And it's not because they have a cavalier attitude here. You know, they lost the Crimean War, and the Austrians and the Prussians didn't do anything to help them, and they lost to the British, the French, and the Ottomans. So maybe they're taking a look at this growing entity known as the United States as perhaps a future ally down the road. You know, America now is becoming what? More attractive on the world scene here, perhaps? So don't lose this war. Don't lose it. Beat the Confederacy. In fact, Russia will send a small task force to New York City in 1863 on a state visit. Interesting. Interesting what you see here. And yet they will be allies after December 7, 1941. And they're going to change the war. The two of them. They'll win the war. But that's down the road. Anybody else have any questions or comments? That was really a good one. That's it. We're done.